Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another session of The World Reconfigured, Russia's War on Ukraine. I'm Cynthia Hooper from the College of the Holy Cross.
And I'm Steve Barnes here from George Mason University. We're really excited about our guest today. Professor Oxana Shevel is with us from Tufts University. Oxana is educated in 3 countries, getting undergraduate degrees in her native Ukraine, but also graduate degrees in the United Kingdom and also here in the United States, where she got her PhD in government from Harvard. Oxana is really truly a phenomenally sort of widely read and she writes very widely on the politics of Ukraine, the politics of Eastern Europe. We were just talking before we came on, followed an absolutely fantastic sort of live tweeting of her being on a panel with John Mearsheimer and sort of countering a lot of the arguments that he's tended to make about the war. But anyway, we're really, really excited to have you here today with us, Oxana, and we'll turn it over to you to kind of get us started with our conversation.
Thank you very much, Steve and Cynthia, for inviting me, and thank you all for you in the audience for coming. So I'll just start with some kind of thoughts about where things have been and where things are, and then we can have a conversation about the questions and basically anything that comes to mind. But let me just kind of very briefly recap. I think one of the things that I always like to emphasize, I think it's important, and to many of you maybe it's an obvious fact by now, but I think there is still quite a lot of misperception about it, or maybe underestimation, is the resilience and the unity in Ukraine, that this war was both enhanced, but was there already before the war. I think Putin made a humongous strategic mistake attacking Ukraine, and I would say that goes back to 2014 even, not just this full-scale invasion, because the goal that he set and he explains to his society and to the public, elsewhere outside of Russia, is that somehow the West was stealing Ukraine, right? That's Russian sphere of influence. He even later began to claim that Ukraine is not even a country and so forth. And therefore, he had to do this to save, Russian interests. We can talk about NATO, but even sort of outside of that this somehow was something was happening in Ukraine that was Western imposed and need to be corrected. And that's fundamentally wrong. The Ukrainian domestic political process has been complicated, but it has been evolving, and sort of very broadly speaking, since 91, in the last 30 years, Ukraine kind of progressively became more Ukrainian, and we can talk about reasons for it. Some of them are just the virtue of having an independent state. More and more people began to think of themselves as Ukrainian. There is polling data on that. But at the same time, the country remained quite divided, so there was strong pro-Russian constituency in the east and the south. And that hasn't really changed since in 2014. So in other words, had Putin not invaded, had he not annexed Crimea, had these regions continue to vote in Ukrainian elections, we would have seen what we saw in the previous 30 years, which was basically more kind of pro-Russian government alternating with more pro-Western leaning government, pro-Russian parties having strong representation in the parliament, being able to influence Ukrainian domestic political process. Putin, of course, had all these levers of influence through media, through oligarchs, through energy, and so forth. So in other words, Russia would have continued to play important role and, influence things that were happening in Ukraine, not controlling them fully, but certainly having an influence and substantial influence. But all of this, again, kind of paradoxically, because Putin set out to prevent it, essentially disappeared since it began to disappear very rapidly already after 2014, and essentially it disappeared entirely after 2022. The society became much, much stronger, if you want to put it, anti-Russian. Support for NATO is very high. Support for EU is very high. In the regions where there was no support or very little support, especially for NATO in the East and the South, it's kind of like unbelievable that majorities in those regions now are in favor. If you talk about things such as memory politics, again, Putin claims there was so-called falsification of history. Those views in Ukraine also changed, also not in a way Russia likes to see. Language situation, right? There is not only people support Ukrainian as state language and state promotion of the language, people are now switching to speaking Ukrainian more actively than they did before. Again, there is polling data on that. So, and I think all of this led to this great unity in the face of aggression that, again, Putin completely underestimated, because when he was asked, I remember one of the Valdai meetings, the journalist asked him, what do you make of these changes in opinion in Ukraine? And he's like, oh, that's all wrong. That's either either you can't trust opinion polls at all, or people are suppressing that through pro-Russian preferences. So in other words, there is this fascist junta running the show, and basically people are afraid to say that they like Russia or are pro-Russian or what have you. But once, again, we can sort of see the logic there. The expectation was once Russian troops are there, that they would be welcome as liberators. And that's why, there were all these plans to capture Kyiv very quickly, parade uniforms found and these destroyed vehicles. And of course, all of this, did not take place. So in a way, it's sort of not surprising, or maybe it shouldn't be surprising, but I think it has been surprising for many. And I don't think Putin drew any lessons from this, right? And then again, so we have the situation. So he has not changed any of his objectives. So there hasn't been any kind of like reconceptualization, rethinking. If anything, they buckle down. They claim that all goals of the military operation, so-called, will be fulfilled. So the goals have been to overthrow and essentially destroy Ukraine as a separate nation and state. So to have some kind of puppet regime in Kyiv under the guise of denazification. So that is clearly not happening. I can't imagine a scenario where that particular outcome is likely at all. So we have this kind of grinding war now. So for the last, many months, they're fighting over Bakhmut. One of the goals has been to quote unquote liberate Donbas, right? Bakhmut is in the Donetsk region. Even if it were to fall in the next several weeks or months, I mean, predictions have been that it will fall already in January. We are now at the end of April. I mean, it's possible that Russia eventually will capture it after they destroy every building. Then what, right? So then, there'll be sort of similar situation probably over the next town, which is reinforced and fortified. So it seems to me that now Russia is going to try to dig in where they are. I don't think they'll officially announce that they're changing their goals, as in like, okay, we are going to abandon, our bigger goals, and we are going to say that we already won. But I think in practice, since the winter offensive didn't produce the results, it seems anything resembling to what they wanted. So they are going to now try to hold on to what they have, at least until and unless they are in a position to try to go for more, and hope that basically both the Ukrainian society, Ukrainian military, and the West will get tired. I think that's, to me, seems like the most likely short-term strategy on the part of the Russians. And I think here comes the question, like, how likely is that to happen? So in Ukraine, the resolve remains very high. So people, again, if you look at the opinion polls, close to 90% believe that the country will win. There is no domestic support or very little support for anything kind of negotiated settlement, because again, Ukrainians understand what that means. They literally conducting genocidal policies on the occupied territories. It's not some sort of like peaceful situation under different regime. I mean, it is literally destruction, and we've seen that. Soviet Union did that in Western Ukraine in the 40s. So it's the same playbook. I mean, people are getting killed, people are getting tortured, children are getting, destroyed, kidnapped. Ukrainian culture is getting destroyed. So this is not clearly, for the society, kind of some territorial concession is acceptable, right? Now, that said, when these Ukrainians start their planned military offensive, which everybody's talking about, it is going to happen at some point. It's kind of unclear, and we won't know until it happens what results it will produce, right? And it is possible that, maybe they'll be able to regain some territory. It seems like unlikely, at least in the short term, that there will be some sort of super decisive military victory, right? That they will be able to liberate all of the currently captured territory. They may liberate some. And then I think, the Russians would hope that then the West will be like, oh, well, we tried, didn't work. Okay, let's sort of try to, settle, put some pressure, on Ukraine. I mean, I'm not saying the West will do it, but I'm just saying this is something, if we want to think about sort of what's likely in the near future, I think these are the things we're thinking about, right? What would be, what should be a strategy, the approach, because clearly that's, I think, the plan on the Russian part, that they can outlast, and eventually, come out on top of this, because if, say, domestic priorities in the Western countries get changed, right? Or there is a fatigue, there are elections, some parts of the political class objects to continued aid. So I think these are all things to think about. I think they could potentially can be quite dangerous, because I think, again, this situation where Putin gets to keep some territory, and that sort of is tried to present as a new normal, I think is very dangerous, not just for Ukraine, because obviously, that's could be millions of people under occupation, the country is in all other ways affected, but the terrible precedent it would create, right, for European security, I think for US leadership, for, autocrats, aggressive autocrats elsewhere, right? So I think that is the kind of situation that should be avoided. So I think that's sort of a cusp moment in a way. In a way, once we know what results the offensive produces, it we'll have more information, and I think it would be we can sort of speculate or try to make predictions with better information. But since this is something that will probably be happening in the next few months, I think it's worth to begin to think about. Okay, depending how that goes, right? What comes next? What would be the right thing to do, right? Like what is realistic, what's not realistic. But again, I want to emphasize that as far as Ukrainians are concerned, that they, if somebody thinks they can sort of tell Ukrainians to stop fighting and they will, they won't. I think the most tragic outcome that I could think of, that if, say, somehow did Western aid, did stop altogether, right? And then Ukrainians would have to fight in a very, very uneven battle, right? But they still will fight. I mean, this is the thing, you talk to anybody, you look, read at any media, this idea that we're just going to sort of fold over, it's not an option. I mean, people think of it as an existential fight, right? This, Russia really came to destroy the Ukrainian nation, as simple as that. So I think that's also something to keep in mind, because I think sometimes analyzing about this war proceeds through very kind of great power-centered lens that somehow, US will make a deal with Russia, or the West will, and then Ukrainians will just fall in line. I think that's a mistake. I mean, it was a mistake to think about this to begin with, and I think it would still be a mistake to think about it now. So maybe I'll end here and take your questions.
Thanks, Oksana. That's a lot to think about. And I definitely want to spend some time on sort of exactly where we're at the moment. Maybe because I'm a historian, I want to dig in a little bit deeper and go back to the period before 2014. And you talked about something you see coming since 1991. You said that Ukraine became more Ukrainian, but that it was still divided in ways that you described up until 2014. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what it meant to be more Ukrainian before 2014, what it meant to be Ukrainian in the midst of this political divide. And if you could just kind of give us some sort of better understanding of, especially what people in Eastern and Southern Ukraine were thinking.
Yeah, let me try to kind of answer both, what it meant to become, more Ukrainian and what these divisions still meant. As you know, in the Soviet period, Soviet government pursued, well, we can say sort of dual policy, right? On the one hand, there was this policy of nativization that Lenin started in the 20s and then had then since been scaled down substantially, but not fully abandoned. And that involved, promotion, so the creation of these union republics. Everybody was assigned an ethnic identity, right? So that you'd say in the passport that you are Ukrainian, Russian, Tajik, what have you. Right, so people kind of it was registered that you have certain ethnic identity, and it was somehow there, right? It may not have been your most important identity and most meaningful in the Soviet period, but it was still there. And on the other hand, there was quite a significant Russification and growing Russification, especially, after, the 50s, the 60s and on. So in Ukraine, it produced a situation that there were many people who were on passport, Ukrainian. But, mixed marriages were high, and Russian was the language of social and political progress, right? Advancement. In other words, you want to go to university, right? That's going to be in Russian,
right?
Unless you maybe study Ukrainian language as sort of a subject, right? You can defend a doctoral or master's dissertation in Ukrainian. And moreover, if you actually choose to speak Ukrainian in these settings outside of kind of where it was politically allowed in the Soviet Union, say at a party meeting where you can, supposed to give a speech, you would actually be considered a suspect, like a nationalist. I mean, I went to college in Ukraine in the late 80s, and we had a few students from Western Ukraine who spoke Ukrainian kind of socially. They were regularly called to the KGB office and asked, why are they doing this? What is the deal, right? But then basically, once Ukraine becomes independent, these sets of incentives change, right? So people, a lot of my friends, like me for that matter, who came from bilingual family, who knew the language, didn't really use it because there was kind of no use really, right? Or why would you? now all of a sudden they're like, oh, it's a new country, it's independent Ukraine. That actually kind of makes sense. Some of them, we can say, rediscovered their Ukrainian identity. It became more meaningful, right? Many people just figured that it is kind of advantageous in the new political environment for their children to know Ukrainian and not only, Russian, as it was the case. So that's why we had this phenomena, let's say in Kyiv, which has been predominantly Russian speaking. There were, like, I think by mid-90s already, almost 90% of schools were in Ukrainian, and there were no protests. Like, why are people not protesting? Why are they not organizing, right? That's exactly because kind of your linguistic behavior followed your political views, right? So in other words, in some of these big cities in central Ukraine, Kyiv most importantly, the attitudes were very sort of similar to Western Ukraine, right? Linguistic situation was different, but attitudes were similar politically. And that's why sort of people were becoming, accepting of their Ukrainian identity. And, but that was different story in the East, right? So in the East and the South, there were, that's not how many people reasoned. And there was percentage of, say, Ukrainian language schooling was lower and all of that. Now, so what it meant, but that at the same time did not mean that these people, in Eastern and the Southern Ukraine wanted to separate from Ukraine, say this creation of these so-called People's Republics in 2014, right? Like, that's not what it was all about. I mean, there were talks about greater autonomy, there were talks about linguistic rights, there were talks about sort of all sorts of things, but not really separation. So, and we can also see what the political class was doing. They were not trying to start some kind of separatist republics or enclaves. They were fighting for political power in Kyiv, right? So Yanukovych and all of these, Kuchma before him, a lot of the upper echelon of Ukrainian political elite actually comes from Eastern Ukraine. And they reasoned, again, in this very kind of sometimes peculiar way, that they were themselves Russian speakers, right? And they would sometimes campaign on coming to power on the ticket of, okay, we're going to make Russian second state language. And then they get elected and they learn Ukrainian themselves and they don't try to do this. And why is that not that they're not trying to do it? Because it was symbolic for statehood. They wanted to keep independent state, right? And one state language was one of these things. It was not so much about linguistic practice, but it was about symbolism, right? And the same goes for dual citizenship. I've done some research on that. So to your question, right? So I think what happens, like, I mean, again, we can't sort of say hypothetically what would have been for sure had some events had been different. But I am almost 100% convinced that if in 2014, if there wasn't this precedent with Crimea annexation, if Russia just left Ukraine, out of it, and Ukrainian elites would battle it among themselves in 2014 after the Euromaidan, I think they would have found some accommodation. We'd seen this before. We'd seen this in 2004. Again, pro-Western president comes to power after mass protest. Eastern part of the country is not happy. There was even some sort of short-lived declared some South Ukrainian People's Republic by the elites before they found an accommodation and some constitutional arrangements and all of these things, and essentially, were able to keep their interests. It was kind of messy bargain. It wasn't, didn't come very easy, but it was done. So, right. So basically, so a little bit long-winded answer to your question, Stephen, but going back to, the attitudes in the East and the South, that once, so the attitudes kind of remained, more Russia friendly, we should say. Yes, there were some people who went through this process that I'm talking about, that many people in Kyiv went through. There were a few of them in the East and the South. There were some, right? But then once Russia attacked in 2014 and then again in 2022, and these are the regions that are suffering the most, right? These are the Russian-speaking regions of Eastern and Southern Ukraine, where they're supposedly protecting people from so-called genocide by literally razing towns to the ground and killing everybody, who happens to be there. So that's where we see this change in these opinions then, right? So if you compare the polling that has come out since the invasion, essentially on every dimension, it's like a big jump, right? Support for NATO, huge jump. Support for the EU, huge jump. And that also affects now the regions in the South and the East, right? Attitudes to the interwar Ukrainian nationalists who were portrayed in the Soviet period as essentially devil incarnate, because they, not only they obviously participated in blood crimes against civilians, but that's not even what they're vilified most for. They were vilified for fighting the Soviet state, right? They fought for independent Ukraine. The idea that, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists has positive views in Eastern Ukraine, like Bandera himself would not have dreamt of it. And that's what we have now. And again, it's a symbol, right? So they were kind of now seen as a symbolic group that fought against Soviet domination at the time, right? So again, as I'm saying, so these attitudes were evolving quite gradually. This evolution certainly affected the center of Ukraine more so than the east and south of Ukraine before 2014. But now after 2014, we even see, this kind of process catching up in the south and the east. And then you look at interviews and there are these ladies. I remember watching a video from liberated Kherson. And this lady says, we learned Ukrainian under occupation. For them, it was a conscious choice, right? That we are Ukrainian, right? Like, yes, we spoke Russian before and nobody bugged us about it. But now that the Russians were there and they were basically, essentially you would be potentially killed if you dare to speak Ukrainian. So they now also began to embrace the language more, right? Like they speak it haltingly, but that became part of, them asserting their Ukrainian identity. And again, Putin has just himself to thank for it or to blame for it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. I know we approach this often from scholarly angles, but it's also important to remember that this is an event that's happening that personally impacts many people that we care about, and one of them is you. And if you don't mind me putting you on the spot here, I was just wondering if you could maybe share with us a little bit of what this war has meant to you personally. Like, I mean, what did you think last February when it was happening? Were you surprised? And, and maybe what's happening with your relatives who are there? And then to add a question to that, there's at least 11 million Russians who have relatives in Ukraine. And I was wondering if, at least in the beginning, again, unscientific question, there's lots of interesting ways of analyzing Russian society, but were you surprised by the response of Russian citizens to the invasion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, definitely. So so basically the response to the invasion. So I have close family there, not like the most immediate family, but I have close family. I've been in touch with them and so forth. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But the as far as what did I think before the invasion? I was in the minority, or I don't know, like whatever minority it was. I didn't think it's going to happen because it just made no sense, right? So yes, I knew there were all of these military assessments that he gathered X number of troops and so forth, right? But I did not think, just for reasons that I explained. I mean, the fact that Ukraine would resist, the fact that all of these perceptions about what Ukrainians are and what will happen were just so wrong to me. So I just couldn't think, like, can he really believe these things, right? Like, it just makes no sense. So when invasion happened, it was a surprise in that sense. And then talking about my friends and family there, it's actually what kept me sane in the first weeks of the invasion, because when you read the Western news. And it was like doom and gloom, right? Like the columns are moving to Kyiv, like that's the end, of the country, like everything is going to fall. And then I'd call my friends and my family in Ukraine, and they're like, no, it's not. Like everybody is mobilized. Like we are doing X, Y, and Z. I had some good friends with teenage children. They were like in like little defense, brigades around their dachas and so forth. And it was like amazing, right? So like you would think that the people would be, that they would be the one who needing help, but I felt like I was going for help to them to keep me sane, because the level of sort of mobilization and enthusiasm and all of this, I think was just quite amazing, right? And I see that continuing, right? So I think the Ukrainian people remain an inspiration. There are obviously difficulties, right? There are some things that are lacking, some decisions that are made that are not, should be better, some, accusations of corruption that civil society is fighting against and all of this. But I think the resolve and the determination and the unity has really been inspirational. And in some sense, maybe people surprise themselves, but I would also say that it builds on the connections, on the civil society links from 2004. Right, because a lot of these networks that kicked into gear and began, crowdsourcing supplies for the army and all of these things, that they are in the, building, and sometimes often the same people who reactivated their networks from 2014. And those in turn were sometimes built on the networks from 2004. So I think this is really interesting, for people who study civil society. I think these kinds of connections are really interesting. So I actually want to, if you don't mind, because I see a question in the chat, and I think either the person is misunderstanding what I'm saying, or if he's not, I would still like to clarify about the Bandera question, right?
Please go ahead. I was going to ask you to comment on that. So
I'm not saying Bandera is a great person by any means. What I'm saying is that the symbolism of this fight against the Soviet state, right? So Ukraine has been justly criticized. So when this law on decommunization was passed, this organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian insurgent army, they were recognized as fighters for independence of Ukraine without acknowledging the blood crimes that they did. So I'm no way denying or justifying it. What I'm saying that in the Soviet period, the nationalists and the Bandera and the UN and the UPA, they were vilified by the Soviet regime, not least, and some historians say more, for the fact that they fought the Soviet state, right? Not so much for their complicity in the Holocaust and all of this, because they were Soviet citizens were the victims. Soviet Union didn't even acknowledge specifically Jewish, suffering and Holocaust as a phenomenon. So they were the enemy, first and foremost, because they fought against the Soviet state. So what I'm saying, what's happening, and again, you don't have to say that this is a good thing. I'm not passing a normative judgment here. But what I'm saying is happening, that this argument that these people fought for independent Ukraine, right, is becoming more accepted by greater part of the society. It doesn't mean they condone the Holocaust. It doesn't mean they want to kill the Jews or the minorities. In fact, far-right Ukrainian nationalists have done terribly in the polls, and more so as these attitudes to these interwar Ukrainian organizations improved, the far-right groups have done worse in the polls. So I think this, again, my point is that this is a symbolism. So when Ukrainians...
Oksana, could I just add one thing to support your point that Putin has in fact created the phenomenon that he allegedly was, like going in to stamp out or whatever. I mean, there are recent surveys that show that before February of 2022, a majority of Ukrainians viewed Stepan Bandera negatively. But after the invasion, within 2 months after the invasion, he has 90% support. I mean, and he's considered, like a figure that should be admired specifically for his resistance to the Soviet state, which is equated to Russia. So, so prior to Russia's invasion, most Ukrainians were quite critical of Bandera and quite critical of far-right movements in their city, in their country as well.
Definitely. And so again, this is not to say that there is some sort of embrace of this radical Ukrainian nationalism. And in fact, I think like after the war, because there was also this polling done when people are asked, what do you think about the Ukrainian nationalist interwar fighters? What do you think of the Soviet armed forces? And what do you think of the current armed forces? And the current armed forces have the most support. So I think after this war, I don't think we're going to be having much debate about Bandera, honestly, if you ask me, because I think there would be new heroes who are more unifying, right, who are more real, who are sort of more from this time period. But there is this definitely symbolism, how people attach to it. And as you're saying, Cynthia, if you look at these polls, when they ask, do you have positive or negative views? And they list different historical figures like Lenin, Stalin, Bandera, Petlura from the early 20th century. You see a jump in positive attitudes to people like Bandera and Petlura, who fought for Ukrainian independence, and that's how they are perceived, right? And, negative jump to people like Lenin and Stalin and so forth. So again, like just for clarity, I don't know where this question exactly was coming from. I'm not saying Bandera was a great guy, not at all. But I'm saying that the change in attitudes to these groups in Ukraine is about symbolism of fighting Russian aggression, right? And that's how Bandera and the UN and the UPA are perceived.
Let me turn to a member of the audience for a question. Tia or Tea, you can go ahead and ask your question. I apologize if I mispronounced your name.
No problem. I am Tea Tutberidze. I'm a PhD student at King's College London. My question is about, do you think the Western society really understand what Ukrainians, and not just Ukrainians, Eastern Europeans, we are fighting for? Because many times when I have conversation, even in the UK, I think especially young people can't understand what we are fighting for, because I think they are confused. They have confusion. What was the Soviet Union and what we experienced, and what, for example, is a European Union when they just left. Yeah, I think those people don't understand from my point of view. For us, the main thing is freedom, and main thing is democracy, and main thing is a human right, which people maybe here have guaranteed. But for us, people who lived decades and decades under the totalitarian regime, it's a main thing. So do you think we need to more explain the Western society why we need to, not just Eastern Europeans, but all countries, developed societies as well? Because I don't think this war is just for territorial war. Russians need more territory as they don't have enough. No, they have much more than they need. They have unpopulated territories a lot. But this war is exactly this fear what Putin and all dictators have in the world. This fear is people's power, which in the Western societies have. When they don't like their government, since I am in the UK, I experienced changed 5 prime ministers, and who I left in Georgia still is there. So
yeah, yeah, I think,
Yeah,
I mean, this
thank
is,
you.
I generally share your sentiment that I think there is a lot of, people who are less knowledgeable maybe, or who have certain ideological views. This sort of idealization of Soviet Union as some socialist paradise, I think that's like, it always makes me kind of roll my eyes. I mean, I had a roommate once, I called him wine and cheese Marxist, who was like, believed that this great sort of communist experiment. And, but I think it's, more generally that this idea that somehow Russia is this like anti-imperialist force, like anti-capitalist force. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I think we have some even now support some say far left, right? That thinks that yes, there is of course US imperialism, but the idea that Russia is somehow anti-imperialist is just ludicrous, right? It is an imperialist, it's also imperialist power, but it has been historically with different goals, right? Different ideologies. So, I mean, I don't know I generally agree with you. I think there is some lack of knowledge, right? That is probably good to explain, especially if people are genuinely interested, like what was the difference between Soviet Union and European Union? There are a lot of differences. Right, but I think more generally, it is something that, maybe scholarly community more generally, or political class even, has to think about how to counter this Russian narrative, right? They're claiming that they want to have multipolar world, right? And in this multipolar world, countries will have real sovereignty, and US is the one who's trying to subjugate countries and deprive them of their sovereignty. I mean, US has done, many things worth criticism, but the idea that Russia somehow protects country sovereignties definitely, can be and should be challenged. But yes, I mean, as it was just asked, I think, unfortunately, some people, maybe many people, especially I think on this ideological left of the spectrum in the West, do have these views, and maybe they come from not really knowing much about the Soviet period, or maybe they come from certain wishful thinking, or just, as we all have our ideological biases. But yeah, generally, I agree that should be an important conversation.
Can I just push you on that for one second? And I guess this is not meant to be confrontational at all. But is it? I mean, I agree that Russia is imperialist now, but under Soviet power in the late Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. Is it really correct to say that like the Russian Republic was sort of subjugating the Ukrainian Republic? I mean, did Ukrainians differentiate between what was coming from Moscow versus, the communist leaders in Ukraine? Wasn't it all just Soviet power, and Ukraine was a constitutive member of that Soviet state? I mean, I often wonder whether this narrative of Ukraine being, oppressed by the Soviet Union isn't one that's been sort of pumped up after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in part, I mean, to positive ends. I mean, to justify a different national identity for Ukraine, distinct from that of post-Soviet Russia, and to justify, a pathway of different decisions like that could lead to greater integration into Europe. But I did always think that there was an element of artifice involved, not passing judgment on it necessarily, but do you see what I mean? Is it true that in the 80s there was a big distinction?
I see what you mean. One could say, I can see this argument, and this argument has been made, and I would say it sometimes in Russia it's made for very instrumental purposes, to say, like, what are you all complaining, right? Like, this was Soviet Union, 15 republics, everybody was a constituent member, whatever bad things happen in Latvia, right? Like, blame yourselves, right? Or like, everybody is equally to blame, right? Potentially, and certainly not the Russians as an ethnic group. And so, I'm not saying the Russians as an ethnic group should be blamed, but I think in the Soviet Union, right, and before that in the Russian Empire, this sort of great conflation between Russian and Soviet, right? So the Russians that were like, yes, they were a separate, one of the 15 republics, but it was quite a peculiar republic. And the Russians played quite a peculiar role in the Soviet Union. They were not really on the same level as the Uzbeks or the Georgians or the Estonians or even the Ukrainians, right? They were sort of like the closest to communism, the closest to progress, right? Kind of like, they didn't have, for example, Russian Republic didn't have its own communist party. It was Soviet Communist Party, which was, where Russians run. They're not, again, I don't want to say that it was just like Russian ethnic group. It was more complicated this way. But I think it's just, I would agree with you, Cynthia, that it would be maybe overly simplistic to just say that everybody was oppressed in the Soviet Union and the Russians did all the oppression. That would be incorrect and simplistic. But I think it would be also incorrect to pretend that, as you think some in Russia try to do, that Russians did not play any special role, right, in the Soviet Union, in the Communist Party, in the whole communist project, right? Like, we can imagine any of these, say, repressive actions from the 1920s and 1930s. Like, let's just imagine hypothetically, had Ukrainian Republic survived after the, in the 1917, 1920, had it not been crushed by the Bolsheviks, would we have this massive famine, right, in Ukraine, done by the Ukrainian government, like independent Ukrainian government? I don't think so. We have evidence of Ukrainian communists who, yes, in some sense were also fulfilling Soviet policies, right? But they were writing to Stalin and basically raising the alarm about what was happening. It was their family members dying, right? And the Soviet regime said, you know what? The Communist Party is full of rotten Petlura agents, right? We are going to confiscate everything. Like, can we say that deportations from the Baltic countries would have happened and all these people would have died there had these republics been independent, right? So I think, I take your point. I think it is overly simplistic to say that, the Russians did all these bad things to all these other groups that had nothing to do with anything. They were Ukrainian communist elite in the center of power in Moscow, right? There was a pipeline leading Ukrainian communist elites there. But I think it would also be incorrect to say that they didn't play any special role. It was all equal, right? Like, all, the Russians did play a special role in the communist project. Yeah.
One more quick question to follow up. We all struggle teaching, Soviet history to deal with this question. Was there a Soviet identity, or was that just a fiction that the leaders spent a lot of time trying to talk about, like a Soviet identity that everybody shared that trumped national differences? Did that exist, or was it a chimera?
Well, unlike in Yugoslavia, where I think they actually allowed people to write in their passports, write in documents, you can register as a Yugoslav, as opposed to, a specific ethnic group. So in the Soviet Union, that was not an option. You can't write in your passport that your ethnicity is Soviet, right? But at the same time, in the polls, when people were asked, like, how do you think of yourself? Who do you identify with? And that's actually, these polls were done after the end of the Soviet Union as well. And it's just historically, right? Like, Russians more associated not with the republic, not with the ethnic group, but with the empire. They were, I can't remember which scholar said, they were this like empire holding glue, right? So this identity of Russian and Soviet was conflated on purpose, right? Part of it we can say has historical, going back to the Tsarist Empire, but part of it again was a conscious policy. Russians were sent all over the Soviet Union, right? They were sort of sometimes overseeing the local ethnic communist elites because they were kind of more loyal to the communist project, or at least believed to be, right? Again, that doesn't mean that there were also repressions against Russians and the church and all of these things. But I think, to your earlier point, I think it would be simplistic indeed to say that all these other groups were just victims and Russians did all the victimizing, right? that would be incorrect and simplistic. But I think it would be also incorrect and simplistic to say that they were not in any way different, right? And I think in Russia, there is this great resentment to acknowledge the imperial legacy, right? Like there was an imperial legacy, right? There is the sense of superiority. I mean, I had a lot of friends in Russia, and, I'm from a mixed family. And this attitude that we are like, what is this Ukrainian language? Like, why do you bother, right? Like Shevchenko, like, who cares, right? And so that was very much part of, we can say culture of identity. Again, I'm not necessarily saying there was official policy for this, although, there were some policies that fostered this. And I think what really now especially leads to these debates in social media and elsewhere, that there is very little. I mean, many Ukrainians would say not sufficient, and the Georgians might agree with this, insufficient desire on the part of the Russians, even the liberal opposition, to acknowledge this and say, okay, we have this, like the whites in America, right? Like, yes, we personally did not benefit from slavery, but there is this legacy, and we are in some ways, beneficiaries of it. And let's talk about it and kind of deconstruct it. There is great resentment, among, in Russia, even among the liberal circles, to tackle this, right? And I think this would lead to these spats. And sometimes, in the media, sometimes in social media, people write articles, what it means to decolonize the field. We have these discussions, right, as scholars, right? Some people say, what are you talking about? What decolonization? Like, we already teach, like, I don't see I need to change anything the way I teach about Russian history, right? Some people say, yeah, well, I actually, now that I think about it, maybe I do. So I think we're going to continue to have these conversations, both as, as scholars and as people in that part of the world. I think we'll continue that as well.
So as much as I'm a historian and love to dwell on history, let's come to the present and talk about the present a little bit more. And I know you just recently gave a talk on this subject, and I'm hoping you can help people to understand, because I think it's hard to understand what's going on with Orthodoxy, the Orthodox religion in Ukraine right now, especially this issue around the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is subordinate to the Moscow Patriarchate. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of help people to understand kind of what's happening and sort of your sense of how this helps us, to think about Ukraine and Ukrainian identity right now.
Yeah, I've been working on this topic. I just gave a longer lecture last week, and it was in 40 minutes. It was very hard to try to do justice,
And I'm asking you to do it in 5.
I don't know if I can do justice to it in 5 minutes, but let me just sort of, again, just to highlight a few things that are going on. So this process, as I was saying, that, in the Ukrainian society, the changes in identity kind of becoming more Ukrainian, rejecting links to Russia, like that affected the church as well. So it starts with the Euromaidan, because, there has been 3 competing Orthodox churches in Ukraine since 91. There was this one, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy, which was the largest by the size of parishes, and up until Euromaidan also had a larger share of support in society. And then there were 2 smaller ones, the Kyiv Patriarchy Church and the Autocephalous Church. Those were considered kind of schismatic because they were not recognized by the global Orthodoxy, right? Now, during Euromaidan, the Kyiv Patriarchy and the smaller Autocephalous Church very clearly came on the side of the protesters. They basically supported the protesters. They, criticized the regime for suppression of the protesters. And the Moscow Patriarchy tried to kind of take more neutral view, that they're for peace and, that they're faithful on both sides and so forth. And then sort of that began, I think, the process for, not for everybody, but for many in the societies, kind of rejecting that approach, right? That was not the, morally kind of sustainable. And then you add to it kind of, as more time went by after Euromaidan, there were these, again, they were not maybe massive instances, but they were instances when some of the priests refused to do last rites for the soldiers killed in the East because it was fratricidal war. Or the hierarchs refused to stand for the moment of silence in the parliament for the fallen soldiers of the Moscow Patriarchy Church. So there was sort of began this kind of groundswell in the society that, again, not saying everybody, but some communities were basically wanting to leave that church and join the one not affiliated with Moscow. So there were a few attempted parish transfers. The process was very difficult. And then, Poroshenko, the Ukrainian political leaders before wanted to have independent church, independent from Moscow. So during Poroshenko period, that finally happened. So he, with some political arrangements and lobbying of the patriarch in Constantinople, who essentially changed some edict. You're a historian, better, goes to the 17th century, right, when the authority over the Metropolitanate in Kyiv was transferred to Moscow back then. So that edict was canceled, and then essentially Ukraine came under the authority of Constantinople, right? Then these two churches that used to be schismatic, they joined together and formed a new church. And then some of the hierarchs, but very few from the Moscow Patriarchy Church joined, and this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine got created and received the Tomos of Autocephaly, so essentially became like a legitimate Orthodox Church in the kind of religious terms, right, in Ukraine. And then these two churches, the Moscow Patriarchy Church and the new church, have been essentially competing for influence and for parishioners. And the process has been very contentious because public opinion kept, the Moscow Church was losing support. So kind of over time, their support went down. Support for the Saza Church went up, but they continued to keep most of the parishes. So this parish transfer process, when they tried to transfer, was very contentious. Moscow Church invariably blamed that it was some kind of Raidersky, like the illegal takeover. In reality, it's very complicated. I'm not going to bore you with details, but I've looked at the court cases. It's very complicated and actually oftentimes impossible to say what is illegal, like which way would be a legal way. But sort of be it as it may, kind of again, this process, there was another spiral of this confrontation and change in attitudes and sort of, confrontation over it after the invasion. Because, at this point, the Moscow Patriarchy Church not breaking ties with Kirill, who was, blessed the invasion, right? And they claim that they've always been very autonomous, like, yes, but they were, at the same time, they are part of the Russian Orthodox Church. They are in communion with other global Orthodox churches through Moscow. They are not listed as a separate church in the so-called diptych, which is the list of Orthodox churches. So there has been kind of this very complicated process that some of the low-level priests, many parishioners, wanted them to make a formal break, like completely formal break. And they say that they did that in May. They changed their statute, but questions were raised. Again, I'm not going to go into it. Like doubts remain, let's put it this way, if they've really broken the ties. And more importantly, they're really in a dilemma, because if they were to break the ties and say, okay, we are leaving, we are no longer part of Russian Orthodox Church in any way, then they become schismatic, right? Because you can't have two independent Orthodox churches in one country, and now the other one has the Tomos of Autocephaly. So one solution would be for them to merge, but there is so much bad blood and much, kind of the Moscow Patriarchy Church continues to this day to call the other church schismatic, that they don't have grace, that they are sect, so forth. So the idea for them joining the so-called sect is completely unacceptable. But at the same time, if they were to really break ties, like fully, then they become the schismatic ones. So it is really a conundrum. And in the meantime, of course, sometimes, people take, as they see, justice in their own hands. And then we add to it that there have been instances of, collaboration of all of this Russian propaganda in the churches. So the SBU has raided like hundreds of the churches, and they opened some criminal cases. And there is now a law pending to essentially make it illegal to have a church in Ukraine that would have a center of influence, as they call it, in an aggressor state. So again, as I was saying, Moscow Patriarchy Church denies that they're still connected and tied with the Russian church. That's not how the Ukrainian state sees it. And with the changes in the criminal code to make all of this propaganda of aggression and so forth a criminal offense, that's where we are. So some of the, priests and bishops have been charged, the confrontations at the local level in the village when funeral procession would not be allowed in. And then there is like literally a fist fight. So it's not like, it's not great. I mean, I think the state is trying to regulate it now through this law that would make the church as an institution potentially legal, but that also wouldn't solve the problem, because there are many parishioners who go to this church who are loyal, to Ukraine, who are Ukrainian patriots, many low-level priests, and that doesn't seem to be, an easy solution to this. So this kind of unification would be probably the best way, but it seems like the way the confrontation has only worsened in even the last months, and given this long-standing narrative on the part of the Moscow-affiliated church, how this Orthodox Church of Ukraine is schismatics, devils, and so forth. So them, their own narrative basically made it kind of impossible to seek reconciliation. So yeah, so very difficult set of circumstances.
Oh, this is so fascinating. If you don't mind, I want to ask you another question, and I am fully sympathetic to Ukraine. I just am interested in your answers to big questions, and so I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about current Ukrainian like public relations or communications policy? I mean, so I study, Russian propaganda a lot, and Russian media strategies today, and obviously what's being shown on, in Russian media is rigorously limited by the government, and people journalists have suffered enormously as a result, and there's a real insistence on presenting whatever, we know the story, a positive image, and demanding journalists don't rely on anything other than official sources for the narratives that they're allowed to promote. And this is terrible. And the action of like Russian television journalists, in my opinion, approaches, sort of the level of war crimes to a certain degree. But in Ukraine also, there are certain limits on press freedoms. And I actually, to be completely fair, understand that this happens all the time in war. And that during the Gulf War, I mean, the United States, in both Gulf Wars, the United States, among many others, was like very rigorous about limiting the kind of information that that it gave out, and communicating directly with TV organizations like CNN about what they were going to report. So I understand that there are like strategic needs and that everybody wants to have positive stories, but I just wonder, is this just, about like, if you're on one side, then a certain amount of censorship can be good if it promotes the cause that you feel is good? Or, I mean, is it important to encourage unity in certain ways, like, through the media? I also know that like there are these stories, say the Ghost of Kyiv, about sniper that shot down all of these Russian planes, and when Western journalists exposed that to story to not be entirely true, there was sort of an angry backlash from many Ukrainians who said, why are you doing this? Like, why would you try to debunk stories of inspiration when it's important to have stories of inspiration? And when we have so many, so what does it matter? So I know that this is like a very convoluted question, but is there something about, Ukraine's attitude towards freedom of speech right now?
No, this of course is an important question. I mean, as you said, right, like countries at wartime, they put limits on certain democratic freedoms, right, that we, in a peacetime and a democracy would, are taken for granted for the, all the good reasons. So things such as freedom of information, right, freedom of speech, like what counts as propaganda, right? You suppose, you can't spread narratives justifying, invasion and so forth. So I think to some extent, these measures in the wartime, especially, under partial occupation, which is kind of unprecedented, because when we think about even to the Second World War, right, there were countries like US and the UK, which had very harsh laws and collaboration, but they were not occupied, right, like at all. And then there were places like, Europe, which was fully occupied. So this sort of Ukrainian situation, I think in some sense is unique. Like, I don't know what would be the correct international parallel where you have, state is still functioning, but is partly, occupied. And then you add to it the history that the Russian spies were at the highest level of the SBU and so forth, right? Now, that said, I mean, obviously, if you're trying to build a democracy, like these sorts of restrictions at some point, it can be taken too far to the point that, democratic principles begin to erode. And especially if you think about how long will it last. I mean, I personally would be more concerned if these restrictions remain, say, like after the martial law is lifted, right? Mm-hmm. Because now, for example, there is this marathon, like all the TV channels are broadcasting in this one, like it's called like national marathon. So they take turns, like it's 24/7, but some channels are excluded from this, right? So for example, Poroshenko channels, which I can't think of a good reason why they're excluded, honestly, because you can see, the channels that were associated, say, with Medvedchuk, right? Who clearly was, I think, Russian agent. I don't think there is any doubt about that. I mean, not only he was close confidant of Putin, I mean, they exchanged him, he's now in Russia. And I think he was one of the intended puppets, potentially, from the Russian perspective, right, to kind of, rule subjugated Ukraine. But anyway, so I'm saying, like, if this kind of channel is taken, off here, again, just in an abstract kind of democratic freedom of the press, any such notion is objectionable. Again, as I'm saying, to my mind, at least, like in the course of the war, I mean, sometimes these actions can be justified. But like, why is Poroshenko's channels? Why are they off here? Like, I can't think of one good reason, right? Because they are, like, he's, if anything, is sort of, even more, pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian, what have you, ideologically than, say, Zelensky party has been before the war, right? He's critical of Zelensky. He's one of the main, like, if we sort of look at the rankings and so forth, right? I mean, Zelensky is very, very popular, but Poroshenko is like up there. He would be, we can say legitimate competitor, say, like in some election. So some of these, so I guess what I'm trying to say, that I wouldn't say that any of these measures are unacceptable, inappropriate, and like assault on democracy. I think we have to, give Ukrainians some understanding of this really unprecedented situation of the invasion they're in, right? On the other hand, I don't think it should be a blank check either, right? So when we see these sorts of, measures are taken, I think it's legitimate to ask, like, why is that? Like, what is, I mean, as I said, like, I can't think of one good reason why Poroshenko channels are not allowed to broadcast as part of this marathon, right? Now, and then you were asking about these sort of inspirational stories. I'm kind of like, I guess I personally would be less concerned, because what harm is it that there is some, fairy tale that some babushka threw, like, what was it, that they were throwing canned goods at the Russian drones and the drones were successfully destroyed? Maybe she didn't. I mean, there was some discussion like that it wasn't cucumbers, it was tomatoes that were thrown. In the grand scheme of things, like, does it really matter, right? So these sort of like little vignettes, right, that get somebody believing and they get debunked by Western journalists. But I think this kind of thing, when like there is a group of channels owned by this political figure who is, second, third in popularity in the political class, right? And he's not clearly in any way kind of pro-Russian or Russian agent who spreads Russian propaganda. Like, why are they not part of the marathon? Like, I don't know. So yeah.
Hey, I'll let you get back in just a moment, but I want to follow up on this just a little bit, because I think a number of the things that we've been talking about, whether we talk about what's going on in the church, whether we talk about sort of Bandera and the issue of who heroes should be or will be, or this question of press freedom, we're talking a lot actually about what Ukraine's going to look like in a future after the war. And, I think certainly one of the questions that I've often, had in my mind is, what will become of this Ukrainian civic national identity at that moment, especially as we see the extent to which sort of anti-Russia has played such a huge role in this unification in many respects of the Ukrainian people. And so I'm wondering, on sort of this subject, you think that there will be problematics there for Ukraine after the war, but also what are the other big issues that you think Ukraine will have to deal with, not counting, of course, the huge problem of simply reconstructing the country. But I'm just curious, sort of your thoughts on what some of the big issues are going to be in this future when the war is over.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I was actually thinking, I may prove to be wrong on that, but I'm actually optimistic about what this kind of new change in identity means for the, say, political party competition, because I think it would lead to the restructuring of the political party spectrum along kind of like more classic left, right, center, divide. Let me explain what I mean here. Because up until 2014, right, like in the elections, and actually even arguably 2019 election as well, when there were elections, right, the main, even though the parties would say that they are like social democratic or like, centrist or what have you, and they had some, economic platform about, social policy, this social policy, that. In reality, I think people were voting more kind of on this ideological kind of pro-Russian, pro-Western, Ukrainianization, no Ukrainianization divide, right? So the parties, say the Communist Party, right, they were not getting votes because they had some, social policy that resonated with people who cared about social policy. I mean, it was much more that they were, for closer ties with Russia. In the 90s, they talked about recreating Soviet Union, right? And then all of the parties kind of to the right of the political spectrum, they were like pro-Western foreign policy, right? Like no subjugation to Russia, so forth. And that was kind of the main dividing line, right? So all of these other things that, I mean, I think like in a healthy party system, voters should be concerned about and kind of making their decisions on, right? What are going to be exactly social policies, right? Like the pension reforms, right? Like all of these economic measures, that kind of got subsumed in this identity divide, right? And I think now that there isn't that much of an identity divide. In other words, I think any party in the post-war Ukraine that would campaign, like, I mean, I can't imagine a party campaigning on anything resembling like pro-Russian platform, like that just not, there isn't sort of a voter base for it, right? But there could be now real party differentiation on all of these socioeconomic issues that they actually would not just have to say that they are for social justice, they would have to have some concrete, policies in mind that, they can sell to the voters, right? And then I think on the cultural end of things, it would probably become more kind of more specific, right? Like if we're talking about, say, educational rights, right? Okay, so there has to be some, regulation, and maybe some parties would advocate for greater, number of schools in minority languages, and some may be, so the debate is going to be kind of more about these specific things, right? Like, is Russian literature going to be studied in schools? And maybe that would even be local level debate, right? Because in some parts of the country, that's not even, people don't even want this. There is now not just decommunization, there is like de-Russification. They're removing monuments to these various imperial figures, right? Who are from Catherine II, to even Pushkin, even, and that it's some way sort of a result of the war. But you can imagine in the post-war, I can imagine in the post-war context that discussion might proceed at the local level, because in some parts of the country, they may actually still want to keep the Pushkin monument potentially, right? Or they may want to have greater extent, say, Russian literature is still going to be taught in schools, like in many schools it's now not taught. And so I guess what I'm saying, maybe that's a little bit optimistic, but I can see good coming out of this, right? Like being divided in many ways. Yes, in some ways it's, the Reconfigured had written a whole book about it, how it sort of strengthened Ukrainian political competition and, more democratic, because neither side would dominate. But it also was like very kind of destabilizing, right? And exhausting almost. So the idea that there is now a new civic identity, stronger civic identity, that people identify as Ukrainians, there isn't sort of much of the debate, like, are we in some ways Russian? Like, no, we're clearly not, right? And the political parties have to kind of catch up with this and now structure their platform and their appeal with this new reality in mind, right? And it's not to say that, again, there would be like whatever would be new pro-Russian party, it wouldn't be pro-Russian as in like, let's join with Russia in the customs-led union. Like that is not going to be the party platform, but they may advocate for things like greater education rights in Russian, right? Or, some sort of different, policy, I don't know, like on some other kind of concrete issue, right? So I think we might move to this sort of thing. And that, again, I think would make Ukraine maybe more typical to some of West European countries with, substantial minority and so forth.
Let's let Taya jump back in. Go ahead, Taya.
Yeah, thank you so much. Before ask the question, I just want to mention about Orthodox Church, not just in Ukraine, but in Georgia. I'm originally from Georgia, and I know what this church is doing in my country. They are Russian propagandists, and those people in this church are KGB's agents. Of course, KGB changed the name, but they are still doing the same, what they used to. So I don't think it's something bad for Ukrainians and Ukraine, what's happened in your country. I wish it happened in Georgia as well. So my question is different now. Do you think after this war, hopefully when Russia defeats Russia in Ukraine politically and militarily, there are possibility in that territory, which we call the Russian Federation. As we know, it's not just one country. There are more than 28, 30 different states which are occupied by Russia historically. So do you think there will be some kind of fight for their independence for those people? Because we know they are not happy in that life what they have there, yeah? Do you think the West will be ready to recognize those states' independence? Do you think they can realize, I mean, the Western politicians, what mistakes were made when the Cold War finished, when allowed them Russians to erase as a totalitarian regime again, allowed them to kill and genocide nations in Chechnya twice, in Ingushetia, in Georgia, in Abkhazia. So do you think it's change some kind of policy in the West to realize what mistakes were made when Russia was so weak in the end of the Cold War? And
thanks, Taya. I'm going to actually cut you off just because we're running short on time, and let's get Oxana.
So sorry about it's quite long, but I hope you understand my question.
Yeah, I hope so. Let me try. I mean, if I understood correctly, I think the West. I mean, this kind of, maybe we can say, Russocentric or great power-centric view on the region, I think unfortunately continues to this day. I think there is definitely great understanding, of the agency of the smaller peoples, in part because of the situation in Ukraine. But I think there is still great fear, just kind of not dissimilar to what was at the end of the Soviet period. But if the Soviet Union were to collapse, there would be all of these like crazy nationalists with nuclear weapons running around, right? I mean, Bush's Chicken Kyiv speech from was it July or June 1991, right, warning against, as he called it, suicidal nationalism in Ukraine, right, like is a case in point. And of course, as you were saying, when Russia was, brutalizing Chechen people, there was not much, condemnation or certainly anything in terms of sanctions and so forth from the West. And I think now there is this also fear in some that if, say, Putin were somehow to lose, and what if Russia collapses, right? What if Russia disintegrates and there are going to be all of these, fiefdoms of ethnic, groups, and what's going to happen to nuclear weapons and all of that stuff. So that's, I think, is a concern. Again, I can't speak, I don't know how widely shared that concern is, but it certainly keeps popping up in various, analyses in Western media. What I would say here is kind of two things. Like, first of all, again, like I'm not saying everybody would agree with me on this, but I think collapse of Russia is not very likely. I think the parallels with the Soviet Union are there, but they're not perfect, right? Because in the Soviet Union, there were these 15 union republics of equal kind of institutional standing, right? And that's how the country disintegrated. And again, there was sort of, this, they had the tappings of the statehood, they had parliaments, they had all of these sort of, some ways, mechanisms, we can say, that enabled that. Now, in Russia is organized as an asymmetric federation. There are some regions that are ethnically designated. There are some that are not ethnically designated. Obviously, many of these ethnically designated regions have been part of Russia for much longer. The Russification preceded them much longer, right? So to say that all of these smaller non-Russian ethnic groups want some sort of independence from Russia, I think that would be great generalization. I mean, there are different sentiments there. I mean, there are some regions that say Chechnya, Tatarstan, historically in the 90s, there was much stronger sovereignty movement than in others. In some others it was weaker. So I think it is possible that if, Putin regime collapses, that there may be some centrifugal tendency on the part of some of these regions in Russia. And then how the post-Putin government would respond, I think the West should be really, kind of engaged with this and thinking about it. I can't, I wouldn't dare to make a prediction of how that might happen. But I guess what I'm saying, first of all, that it wouldn't be I don't think it would be across the board disintegration, as, Soviet Union collapsed and these 15 constituent states. So I think in Russia, it's quite different, both institutional reality and sort of sets of attitudes, right? And then also, I mean, if potentially some region, like say Tatarstan, I don't know, Yakutia or Chechnya, if some of them, were to didn't want to stay in the Russian state. I don't know. I mean, maybe this is something that would be, I think it ultimately would be the job for the new post-Putin government to decide how to deal with it, right? And again, if it is a democratic, if we try to fantasize that there is some sort of democratic, government in Russia, right? And maybe it will want to create a true federation, because Russia is federation only on paper. I mean, the power is incredibly centralized. These regions have no power, right? And maybe if there was genuine, substantial degree of autonomy to these regions, maybe there wouldn't be, even sort of that might be sufficient, in other words, right? People want certain rights, but they may not necessarily want to have a separate state. I don't know. I don't study Russian regionalism, so I can't. But I mean, I guess what I'm saying, sort of generally speaking, that these quick jumps to parallels. Oh, Soviet Union collapsed once Gorbachev weakened. Therefore, if Putin weakens, Russia is going to collapse and we're going to have this disaster on our hands. I think that's just not a good parallel, right? But then that said, if there are some groups and some regions in Russia that may want greater power, potentially to the point of separation in a new, maybe democratic post-Putin Russia, right? I think that would be the task of that government to deal with it. And the West, I think, should be quite attuned to what's going on. And, but that's sort of conversation potentially for the future.
Oksana, this has been super fascinating. I have the honor of the last question, and I just listening to you and thinking about this, I was suddenly struck by how this whole story of the war is highlighting another story of change versus continuity, right? And we can see very clearly, especially when we go back and look at the documents and talk to people, that there's been all kinds of change in Ukrainian attitudes and sense of nationhood since 1991, and then change again after 2014, and then change again after 2022. And there's other points in there like the Orange Revolution and stuff that you've mentioned where there's arguably also change. And I think there's a lot of consensus around the idea that lots of that change has had to do with younger generations, and and I see that in my students and who have really grown up in the years since Putin's annexation of Crimea until now, and have been sort of radicalized and transformed by that, but also increasingly committed to again, alliance with Europe and following different norms of business and rejecting corruption and all of these things. So, I mean, again, when people talk, there was an interesting question in the chat we didn't have time for, but asking about progress in fighting corruption in Ukraine. And I think there is a sense that a lot of this effort to have more transparency is coming from younger people, many of whom have worked as investment bankers in the United States, or what have you, been educated abroad or even at home, but who understand that that's a more acceptable way forward if the goal is better integration, better access to investment and all kinds of things. So Ukraine seems to be a story of change, and actually pretty significant change over relatively short, historically periods of time. And then though, we're stuck with Putin's Russia, and in a sense, the entire post-Soviet era, or even in a sense, the idea that, things haven't changed much since, the Brezhnev era in a lot of ways. And it seems like there's much more of a story of, deep continuities, particularly in regard to the passivity of Russian citizens and their lack of agency and yada yada. I just want to ask you, why isn't there some kind of generational transformation taking place there, or do you see that happening, or is it just that the government has sort of invested in trying to, is it an issue of propaganda? The government has invested in kind of trying to message young people in a way that keeps them loyal to one particular vision of superiority, or what is it? And again, I know I'm throwing these very general questions at you, and I apologize.
No, this is a very important question. Again, I don't think we can do justice in whatever minutes we have left, right? But there is, of course, this discussion and this debate, now, say, with these opinion polls, right? This idea that the Russians are supportive, either actively or passively, that there is no, very little opposition. Is this a function, as you're saying, of something about Russian society that has this historical continuity, right? Or is this more kind of the effect of this state totalitarian control and the propaganda? And if that were to be removed, we would see sort of different society, maybe more pluralistic, more activist, more democratic. I don't think we really would know the answer to this question, right? Because it is what it is, and one could hope that it's different. In reality, quote unquote, that Russian society is somehow different, but people are not speaking up. Or you watch some of these interviews with these Russians on the street, and this babushki are going to say, yeah, let's go kill all these Ukrainian children, and it's horrifying, right? And I think your earlier question of relatives in Russia. We have very distant family. We are not really in touch with them, but I have plenty of people, good friends of mine, who have close family in Russia. And essentially everybody broke ties because the narrative from there was we are coming to liberate you on the tanks. Like I have a friend who has a brother there, and the brother is like, I'm coming on the tank and I'm going to show you what's what, right? Like, so it's completely horrifying, this sort of the level of brainwashing to the point that you believe state propaganda as opposed to your family member, sometimes very close family member, right, in Ukraine. So, I mean, Gulnaz Sharafudinova, of course, wrote this whole book about the Red Mirror, right, how Putin was able to tap into certain sentiments that are very deeply felt in Russian society, the sense of resentment and humiliation from the 90s, this kind of great power, you know, superiority, talking about, you know, how different Russians were from other ethnic groups in the Soviet Union. I mean, you know, this taking pride in like great power status. I mean, Ukrainians don't care about being a great power, right? In that sense, like that's not something that sort of ticks your buttons, right? But it does for many Russians. So I don't have a satisfactory answer to you know, unfortunately, but I think it is basically kind of a debate, right? On the one hand, there is this clearly evidence of historical continuity. On the other hand, we don't want to make this historically deterministic arguments that some nations are just historically X, right? And some nations are historically Y. We, of course, saw the period of the perestroika, right? We saw a period of, you know, early 90s when there was much greater societal activism, you know, there was support, you know, for all sorts of democratic, but we can say measures. And then this big debate, like who lost Russia, right? Like what went wrong, in other words, after 1990. So maybe again, if there is another historical period of potential for democratization or change in these, maybe Russian elites would do it differently. One criticism I heard, which resonates with me, what Yeltsin should have done, what he didn't do, is to exactly dismantle this legacy of the KGB, right? Like this opening of the archives, questioning the past. We talked about difficulties that Ukraine, you know, has, you know, with kind of dealing with a difficult past. But there is no dealing with a difficult past in Russia. I mean, they have criminalized any kind of, you know, anything other view on the Second World War other than what, you know, the state considers this glorification narrative. Like, I mean, you go to prison for really long, you know, time. In Ukraine, by the way, if you know, this decommunization law, which was much criticized for stifling free speech, I looked up statistics recently for something I was writing about. In 4 years since the law was passed, there were 2 people who received suspended sentences for displaying some banned communist symbols. So really the law has been not used to stifle freedom of speech. But in Russia, it's a different story. I think there are over like 9,000 people who have received like real prison sentences for kind of, you know, these similar offenses. So in a way, I think, again, that goes, Cynthia, to your earlier point, should Russian society be expected to tackle its own legacy of colonialism, right, of imperialism towards, you know, in at least in its immediate neighborhood, right? Or are they again going to be portrayed as victims, right, that we have been like misunderstood and blamed for things that like we didn't do? It was Putin's war, right? Like we had nothing to do with it. Again, we're putting a little bit the cart before the horse because we're not there yet. But I think if we are there, I think that would be the kind of conversation that I would hope that the Russian society will decide to have, because I think that would be the way to not, you know, as the expression is, to stand on the same grabli, like that you kind of like make the same mistake again, right? So.
Thank you so much, Oksana. Well, we've kept you past our appointed hour, and I think that's just part of how interested we are in all of the things you're sharing with us. We're really lucky to have you in American academia. We're really lucky to have you join us and give of your time on a Friday afternoon. So thank you very
so
much. For
thank
everybody,
you for the questions here.
Yeah,
It's an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, for our audience, a reminder that next week we're going to switch gears and have another one of our sort of book group meetings. We last time read Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, which Cynthia has used to great success in her classes in the past. This time we're going to do something that I've used in my classes, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. I have a lot of thoughts about Solzhenitsyn. He's a complicated and interesting figure, but the book itself is also quite interesting. So I think it'll be a great conversation. So I hope you get a chance to read it, and I hope you get a chance to join us. I wish everybody a fantastic weekend and a great week, and we'll see you back next Friday. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.